Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to speak with you. I do want to recognize that we have one elected official in the audience for sure, and that's Representative Craig Horn from Union County. And I also want to recognize Representative Stam's education advisor, Greg Cinders, who's here. Both should be down negotiating something, I think. But thank you for taking the time. Yeah, I thought it was done, right? So anyway, so we want to recognize you. Are there any other elected officials I should recognize? Okay, so today's conversation, why North Carolina can and must have the best education system in the nation. I think we all know that we must, but I would like to kind of go through why we're not quite going in the right direction or not going up where we need to. So I'm going to cover, first of all, the depressing stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit of what we call the crisis of mediocrity, that we're facing in North Carolina, and then a bit about moving the needle on education. There's a lot of hope. There really are best practices. There is no silver bullet, but there are best practices that we can be driving toward, and we should be driving toward, and then ultimately to drive forward, we have to have a vision. And so Best NC is committed to helping collaborate with thinkers like the John Locke Foundation and a wide swath of education experts to set a vision and a course for education in North Carolina. So who's Best NC? Donna, you did a great job of introducing us. We're over 100 business leaders in North Carolina. Here are some of the companies that are represented. All of the members are C-suite executives or owners of their companies that are really committed to education in North Carolina. And it's not about their bottom line other than they know that if we have a top-notch education system, we will have a strong economy, that they will have great customers and they will have great employees. So it's exactly the right people to have that independent voice for education, and I am honored to represent them. 3 things you need to know about me. I'm an entrepreneur. I ran my own importing and manufacturing business for quite a while. And before that, I was a management consultant in public policy. I do have a master's in public policy, so this marries up my 2 loves, business and public policy. I've always been an education advocate. This is when I get choked up. It didn't really occur to me until I got to college that my parents moved from rural northern Minnesota to the suburbs of Minneapolis so I could get a great education. So my sister and I would have the opportunity that we wouldn't have otherwise had to get a college degree, and that happened for both of us. And I'm honored, but I realized you shouldn't have to move to get a great education. And being now a North Carolinian by choice, I've been here for over 15 years, I'm deeply committed to North Carolina. We should have the same expectation. Every student should have access to a high quality education. They shouldn't have to move to get it. And the third is, I'm a parent. I have 2 kids who are in the school system, rising 5th and rising 8th. And so it's important to me, of course, as a parent as well, that we get this right. So why? Why are we doing this work? 1, we're facing a growing skills gap, and I will run through some of the numbers on that. 2, our student performance has really flatlined. It's not going down. We're not going to where. It's just flatlined, and that's a problem. And 3rd, we don't have a talent plan. When it comes to K-12 education, and we do look at the entire continuum of education beyond K-12, but particularly in K-12, the single greatest factor other than the parent, which is the greatest factor, the single greatest factor is the educator who's teaching that student. And so we have to have a talent plan. No business would run their business the way we run education. We need to really think carefully about how are we recruiting, how are we preparing, how are we supporting, how are we developing educators so that we're getting the best possible talent, the best prepared talent in front of our students every day. Okay, now for the depressing stuff. We call it the crisis of mediocrity. First, the skills gap is growing. Recent Georgetown University study showed that we expect a shortfall of 46,000 workers and 77,000 underemployed by 2020. 67% of the jobs by 2020 will require some kind of post-secondary education, not a degree, but something past high school. And right now we are at 58%, which puts us 46th in the nation in meeting our workforce needs.
Can you please define some sort of post-secondary education?
Certificates up. So some kind of certificate.
HVAC certificate,
Correct.
An IT certificate, some specialized.
That's right. Certificates, associates, BA, master's, PhD, in that range. Thank you for asking. Career and college readiness. We have we have the highest high school graduation rate in the history of North Carolina. And yet, the ACT is the closest thing we have to a measure of academic outcomes, and only 16% of our students are meeting all 4 benchmarks for ACT. 47% are not making any of the benchmarks. We're talking math, reading, science, and no. I'm sorry? Yeah, math, reading, science, and history. So almost half are not meeting any of the benchmarks. And ACT, traditionally, we think career readiness, but it's actually a good measure of, are they leaving school with the knowledge they need to have? Well, if you compare us to the other states that have 100% participation, we're dead last. There are 12 states we can compare to. You can't compare to a state that has only their top performing kids taking the ACT, but we can compare to these states, and in that pool are Mississippi and Louisiana. So we have a long way to go in getting our students ready for careers and ready for life. You've all seen this, right? Good is the enemy of great. North Carolina has been good and arguably very good, and at some points even top of our class, certainly in the Southeast and sometimes nationwide. Here's a good example. So math NAEP scores in 2003, we were almost tied with Massachusetts. This blue line is Massachusetts, the green line is North Carolina, the dotted is the national average, and the red is Mississippi, which is the lowest. So in 2003, you can see we were right up there, and Massachusetts is the best performing state in the nation right now, and has been for all this time. But what happened? Everyone is going up. Mississippi's going up, Massachusetts going up, and we've basically flatlined. So there's the same chart, and here's what it looks like for 4th grade reading, 8th grade math, and 8th grade reading. So if you look at these, 4th grade math doesn't look so bad because we're hovering above the national average, but who said average is good enough for North Carolina? You look at 8th grade reading, and we're firmly below the national average. So we should focus on reading, right? No. If you look at our progress on 4th grade math, if you ignore math and just focus on reading, we're 50th in the nation in improving our math scores over the last 10 years. Upward projection matters, right? 50th. 41st, 36th, 34th. This is not a winning record over the last decade. And here's another stat. 31% of our 4th graders can't read at a basic level. A basic level. They're not ready to learn. Rosemary, you know that very well. She's deeply committed to literacy. Pisa is an international study comparing us with other like countries. And as you can see, we are, you can find it in your book. We are at average or below average in math, reading, and science compared to other OECD countries, other like countries. And this matters because now we're talking, are we going to be an average state in a below average country? And next and last in the crisis of mediocrity, we have a talent crisis in our schools. We have a 14% turnover rate of teachers. This measure gets questioned all the time, but is the only measure we have that is comparable from state to state and district to district. And the fact is this is about national average, plus or minus. Our alternative entry candidates are a great source of teachers, but they're performing below our other teachers. It's something we need to tackle and address. And 27%, we've had a 27% decline in students applying to become teachers, to go into the schools of education. 27% decline over 4 years. It's about 6,500 candidates less last year versus 4 years prior.
You're giving us the measurements of how the kids are doing. It'd be interesting at the college level if you measure how these future teachers are doing. Are they measuring up to be able to teach?
Great question. In fact, that's what this data point is. There is an analysis, and actually there's this fantastic new dashboard that just came out that compares all of the schools of education and how those teachers are performing. So you can really clearly see which school of education is doing a better job in maybe a particular subject or a particular grade. It's very, very important. That kind of transparency is really important. Another thing, though, is you can also see in your book the types of students who are becoming teachers. And I will say, just in my myth-busting, with my myth-busting hat on, page 13, the SAT scores and the GPA, high school GPA scores of teacher candidates are the same as the other students in their schools. So there's this myth that we're taking from the bottom. We're not. But we are not considering whether or not they can handle a classroom or they have the EQ, right, that's necessary. But we do know that we are attracting a good quality candidate into our schools of education. I'm so glad you asked the question. It's on a lot of people's minds. So these numbers, again, are not unusual for this country. But we know we can do better, and we believe North Carolina in particular can do a lot better. And we can lead the rest of the country. Here's another challenge that we see. When you go into a typical school, every single teacher in that school reports to one principal. Sometimes you have kind of artificial tiers of teacher leaders. Assistant principals sometimes take on some responsibility, but this is really what the schools look like. From a business perspective, is that a normal, acceptable span of control? Absolutely not. Span of control should be 6 to 8. You should never have more than 6 to 8. So when we hear principals complain about doing 3 performance evaluations for every teacher every year, no wonder. No wonder. And no wonder the quality is, well, they're all kind of looking the same. They're all highly effective. Well, if you had to do that for all of these teachers, so one thing we need to think of when we think about a talent plan is how do we reorganize the schools? How do we allow teachers to become teacher leaders and coaches and mentors? How do we allow our best performing teachers to influence more teachers and more students? There is no way that one principal can be coaching 60 teachers or 25 teachers. It's just not possible. It depends on, every school is organized differently. But let's say that you do. Let's say you have one assistant principal and you have 50 staff members. It's still, right? And it's something that needs to be tackled because then there's the question of what is the pathway of an assistant principal?
Is that a component of the rationale for the schools within school? Coming from having been out of school for a few years, the concept of having a 1,000-student school and having 5 principals is foreign to me.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of grappling with this issue and a lot of different ways to do it. The small schools model hasn't always worked. It hasn't been as effective as one would hope. And again, if you go to 1,000 students, you're still talking about a school that has probably close to 50 teachers in it, and you're still stuck with this problem. Our best principals will put in place teams, right? And they'll have a lead teacher and so on. The problem is that those teachers don't get any additional compensation for doing that extra work and having that extra impact. There's no systematized way to allow for that. So what happens is you get burnout, right? And then the only person who's willing to raise their hand is somebody who isn't necessarily that great at it. So how do you put in place a systematized structure? And this is something that the NEA has supported, that last year's Institute for Emergent Issues. This is something that should not be controversial, but when it's actually put on the table, people get a little anxious about it, right? Because how are you going to make sure that it's fair? Well, within our businesses, how do you make sure that it's fair? It's not always fair, you do absolutely the best you can to focus on student achievement, and that should be enough. This transformation from a very flat structure to an organized structure happened in the nursing profession. It happened decades ago. It was not an easy transformation, but it happened. And with working with educators, I know we can get here. New emerging teachers want this. They want this. They want to coach, they want to mentor, and they also want to know that they can become that coach or mentor. They have a career opportunity that doesn't take them out of the classroom. So this is something that's supported by research. It's certainly the way we can get the most effective teachers impacting the greatest numbers of students. So, since it was depressing, we have to go with our Winston Churchill quote: "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." We like to say Best NC is optimistic and courageous, and we're willing to do what's right by those who influence student achievement the most. So, we've just exited the scary part, but are there any questions before I move on? Okay, so moving the needle. So as a business organization, we are very evidence-based. We look at best practices. We've looked at studies from around the world. We've looked at studies within the United States. What is consistent across the best performing systems in the world and certainly within the United States? High quality resource teachers and leaders. Who here is surprised that that's the key? Okay, none of us, right? High quality resource school teachers and leaders. More equitable allocation of resources. This is something North Carolina has tackled in many ways. We fund more of our education system at the state level than most other states in order to provide more equity across school districts. We also have low wealth funding. We have various mechanisms. It's become a little bit messy, but I would argue that North Carolina is certainly doing this better than most other places, which is when you hear that we're 47th in the nation in per pupil spending, that's true. We're also, as you saw, hovering around average for student achievement. You don't get there by mistake, right? I believe that we get there by having a commitment to equity. North Carolina's had a historic commitment to equity, that every student deserves the right to a high quality education. Autonomy with accountability and teacher-principal collaboration. That's a lot. Let me unpack that in a minute. The best performing systems in the world set expectations. They say, here is where we want our students to be, but they don't dictate to the teachers how to get there. So educate your teachers, educate your principals in how to do their job. But just like in any business, right? So when I had my manufacturing business, I had a sales team. I set expectations. Get this account, hit this number. But I didn't micromanage them. They're the experts, right? Same thing with teaching. Set the high standards, set the expectation, and allow the teachers and principals to collaborate to find the solution that's right for their students. And pre-primary education. Students coming to school ready to learn is consistent across the world. So we believe North Carolina is uniquely positioned to have the best education system in the nation. This isn't just talk. This isn't just talk. So when we think about North Carolina, and I'll get to a little bit of the history, but we have levers that other states don't have. When you think of education transformation in other states, you hear these battles about finance equity and battles with the teachers union. We don't have those battles. We have much more critical, nuanced work that we need to do, and we don't have to worry about those battles. We can really go and focus on what needs to be done for our students. I'm going to not read through every single one of these, but North Carolina has a historic constitutional commitment to education. One thing that I think you might find interesting is 1977, universal kindergarten for all. Remember we talked about pre-primary education, that's an example. There are only, correct me if I'm wrong, 16 or 18 states in the country right now that have universal kindergarten. Some have half day, some have none, not universal. North Carolina led the way, and I really think that when you see those improvements that we were gaining in the 80s and the 90s, that had something to do with that, and had something to do with having a vision for educators. Some of the bright lights, things that we can kind of use as the foundation as we move forward. We have a commitment to early learning. We have what I described as finance equity. Data and accountability, we have some of the best data in the country. We talked about understanding the quality of the teacher. Getting that out more, making that more transparent is critically important, but the data are pretty much all out there. Early college programs, we have some of the best early college programs in the country, community college system, and of course our nationally recognized public university system. Those are great things on which to build a foundation. And so to build that foundation, we're going to set a vision, working collaboratively with a broad spectrum of stakeholders. I will say not working on everyone getting everything they want, but how do we set a vision that we can all share? And it's going to be led by Best NC and the business community. And the reason is business is the ultimate end consumer. I started with this at the beginning. We're the end consumer of education. We have a long-term focus. We're not subject to the whims of 2- and 4-year election cycles or superintendents or university presidents who change over. The business community as a force is consistent and can be continuous. When you look at Massachusetts, they didn't become the best education system in the nation by accident. It was actually the business community that got together over 25 years ago and set a vision for education and held it consistent for decades. We're also independent. So when I walk in the room and I say I am pro-educator, and I'm not representing educators, I have a much more authentic voice. I can really speak on behalf of human capital, which gets me to the fourth point, which is we understand the value of talent. Our companies are only as good as the people we employ, and that's the same with education. Our education system is only as good as the way we prepare and develop and support our educators. And so what Best NC does is we do three things. We convene, we vision, and we advocate. Convening is really important. This should not be a conversation that leaves people at one side of the room and the other side of the room throwing bombs at each other. This should be a conversation where we can all get together and say, can we all agree that student achievement is the top priority? Can we all agree that educators need to be high quality? Can we all agree that leadership matters? And then suddenly it's amazing how much you can agree on. And the things we disagree on tend to be the things on the fringe, which is great. So we really set out to make sure that we're convening, that all voices are being heard, helping with those voices to set a vision. And then we, of course, do advocacy work. We advocate for programs and policies and research and awareness and all the things that need to get done, not just in the public sector, but also how does philanthropy engage? How do businesses engage? How can nonprofits work and drive toward this shared vision so that we're all really working together? So the vision process, I'm just going to walk you through really quickly. We have been working for a year on a draft education vision. The final version of that comes out momentarily, and will lead into real action work going forward. But as you can see, when I talk about convening, we had over 350 people participating in 18 working groups last fall. They came up with over 600 recommendations. We reviewed 20 other strategic plans. This was really listening to voices representing the entire state of North Carolina and best practices around the world. We focused in on things that do these things. They move the needle on student success. They are evidence-based. They are scalable, actionable, and feasible. Ooh, I guess that's what happens when we get to the MAC. But the conclusion was we need to support students, elevate educators, and raise expectations. And beyond that, we got into pretty specifics. So for example, in the approaches, you have making sure that every student is aware of their career opportunities. Okay? Really important to get all that on paper. But the next step is how do we act on it? So we are going to put together 3 action groups starting this fall. This is the working, you're the first to see this. This is the working group. Foundations for learning, making sure that every student is ready to learn. Elevating K-12 educators, and not just thinking about teachers and principals, but do they have the adequate support so that they're in the classroom using their talents the best and not, I don't know, putting boo-boo bunnies on injuries, that we have adequate nurses and adequate counselors so teachers can do what they do best. And then school to career transitions. So do we have the right pathways from middle schoolers really knowing what their career opportunities are, all the way through somebody who's going through a retraining program in their 50s because they want to change into a different field. So what does that look like? And this aligns very closely with the NC Works effort and others that are being done with the Department of Commerce. The community colleges are engaged, the university system, and so on. But as you can see, you can't do one without the other, right? If you just take one, you're going to miss something else, right?
You've yet to address, I mean, you went through all the statistics, you've yet to address the problem that the U.S. Department of Education presents. You're focusing on best NC and what we can do, but there's so many prohibitives and mandates and all of this stuff. You just look at their website and you see all the stuff we have to do.
Right.
That impedes our ability to act independently. How is best NC addressing that?
So I guess it really comes down to great talent. I mean, it comes down to having really great teachers in the classroom, and certainly we want to look at how can we remove any barriers, but that's what this is all about, is how do we look at the entire experience of the teacher, and do they have too many forms that they need to fill out, right? Are there too many compliance issues? We really do need to look at freeing them up to do with what they do best, which is to teach. And certainly looking at compliance issues is one of them.
It looks like it's just a one-way street. They say fill out a form, and we fill out a form. You mentioned Massachusetts, best education in the country. And for $250 million, they gave up their best education for Common Core because they extorted $4 billion. You don't get raised to the top money without the federal government. That's a problem. Best NC cannot be best unless we act independently.
Yeah, we are very closely monitoring the Standards Review Commission, and also, you know, the State Board of Education is ultimately responsible for the standards in our state. They set the standards. They do not set the curriculum, and they do not determine how the standards are taught. They just embarked on their review cycle that will be going on over the next year. We're actively involved in that conversation because we know that the standards need to be reviewed on a regular basis and should be owned by North Carolina and make sure that they represent the needs of North Carolina. And we believe that you have to have standards that are commensurate with other states. We do want to know that a student in North Carolina is performing at a standard that is comparable to Massachusetts. We do need to know that because for years we had convinced ourselves we were living in Lake Wobegon. I mean, we absolutely believed that we had 80% proficiency rates. We can't have that anymore. Students deserve to have a high standard. So I agree with you, we can't have dictates from the federal government. I do believe that there needs to be some communication and some expectation that's universal across our country because we can't continue to fail compared to other countries like we have been. So it's a nuanced, it's not that cut and dry as with all of this. And so that's why it's so important that we're doing the convening work, because I really think that when we get people to sit down, Terry Stoops was involved in our working group talking about standards. When you really sit down and say, do we want high standards? Yes, right? What does that look like and how can we get there without, frankly, throwing the baby out with the bathwater? We cannot start from scratch. It's $20, $30 million to develop brand new standards. I don't want that burden on our state. So.
Other questions or comments?
So nowhere in the presentation did I hear the word parents. I hear that the business community is going to lead this because they're not held to the vote and being accountable. Foundation, public-private partnerships is essentially nonprofits working on policy, but it's confusing confusing because we have the Academic Standards Review Commission, which you mentioned, we have PPI, we have our elected officials, for taxpayers and parents. Where is that accountability? Where's the open transparency?
Absolutely, great question. We are an advocacy organization, right? So we will only advocate to the ultimate. We can't make standards. We can't set policy. We will work with the policymakers and do our best to encourage great ideas and great transformation, but we can't. We're not in those positions. We can influence it. But in terms of transparency, we are working on the website for the North Carolina Education Vision. We invite everyone to participate and be involved. This cannot be done by one entity. It can't be done by even one slice of North Carolina, whether it's the business community or educators. This needs to be done together. And so we are absolutely committed to transparency and working together. In terms of parents, I kind of mentioned earlier on that parents are the single biggest factor. When it comes to a student coming to the school door, then it's the education system accepts, and takes every student as they are and has to deliver the best possible education system to those students. So I think we walk a line of, do we want to tell parents how to educate their parents? No. So I don't think that that's within the scope of what Best NC is working on.
Well, this is the problem. We largely have Common Core because of the business community, the Department of Education at the federal level, and also foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So there should be some heavy lessons learned with that.
Yep.
And the role of the parent doesn't end when you send a kid to pre-K or kindergarten or whatever.
Right,
It's
absolutely.
an ongoing process, and parents, to me, remain the primary educators.
Absolutely, absolutely. When I say schoolhouse door, I don't mean kindergarten. I mean the entire, every single day. It should be a relationship between the school and the parent. There's no question about it. And to your point about Common Core, I absolutely take that. I've only been doing this in this role for 18 months or just shy of 2 years, so I wasn't involved in any of that conversation. But I will tell you, lessons learned. I think that the whole Common Core discussion failed to embrace enough of a broad audience, and I think that we in our role, we're out to learn lessons from anything that didn't quite work as it should have. So I think that's really an important point. It's one that we think about often, and we look for our friends and partners to keep us in check on that point. So thank you. Completely agree. You were barely first.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for speaking today. My memory goes back about 5 or 6 years, and I noticed you don't mention in your resume your association with Great Schools in Wake, the work there. Maybe you traveled the road to Damascus on that and recognized what happened there. I don't hear socioeconomic diversity in your presentation, whatever, but it's really hard for me to not look past that and take what you're saying seriously here, recognizing the past association. And I'm very aware of what went on back then, the protests, the activities that went on at school board meetings. I just feel like that needs to be said today.
I'm happy you brought it up. I was briefly involved with Great Schools in Wake when it first started as a nonpartisan pro-Wake County education, high-quality education, because I had been sort of a kitchen table analyst for education, just deeply committed to education, and found that, and it's still true today, that the Wake County school system doesn't serve our disadvantaged students well. And I was really interested in engaging that conversation. When I didn't feel like it was the right fit for me, I left rather quickly. And I appreciate anybody who wants to get involved in the education discussion. I appreciate them for their commitment, but it wasn't the right. I am a truly nonpartisan, focused on student achievement person. But thank you. Oh, I saw almost claps over there, so go ahead.
I'm wondering how this, we've got a lot of statistics about how students are performing in North Carolina relative to other places and so on. But the question that, especially since this is being driven by a business community, how this all comes out in the wash. I mean, is 10 years later, okay, are business people finding a big quality difference between the workforce in North Carolina? I mean, is that translating into
Economic prosperity?
well, reality.
Yeah.
Not just economic prosperity. I mean, is it really the case that someone comes through North Carolina's school and 10 years later they're somehow worse in the workplace and whatever than someone in Massachusetts? By the way, I think our growth rate is probably better.
Our growth rate?
Growth.
Well, and that's a good, and there's also, they have really high achievement gaps in Massachusetts. We're not going to whitewash that at all. And what got them from where they were to where they are was different than what's going to get us from where we are to where we want to be. So I don't want to make this sort of, let's follow the Massachusetts roadmap. I want to be really clear about that. In terms of achievement, individual students, we have to look at the aggregate. When we only have 58% of our population getting some kind of post-secondary and our workforce demands 67%, if we don't bring that up, we will not be delivering the needs of our businesses, and businesses won't either move here or expand here. So absolutely, if we don't really get on this and make sure that students are coming out of high school ready for some kind of post-secondary experience and then getting that post-secondary experience, we will be finding this gap, and we won't be able to attract the kind of business we want here. So yes, there is a direct correlation. With my students, with my kids in the system, they're going to be just fine, right? They have a strong parent, 2 parents who are welcoming them home from school every day and engaged in their education, but there is a whole population of students in North Carolina. Do you know that there are schools in North Carolina that have 5% proficiency rates? That matters. So if we don't bring up those schools, let me say more positively, if we do bring up those schools, imagine what that does for business. Imagine what that does for the economy. Every student coming out of our education system matters. They will either contribute to the economy or they will take away from it. Which one do you want?
I was looking through your book here, and I don't see any measurement on extracurricular activities. Like, if children are involved in athletics, does that make them more encouraged to stay in school or to study harder? Or if they're in Spanish club or any type of extracurricular, is that a measurement tool, or should that be in the conversation of making children more dedicated to their education because they're connected?
It's not something that I hear often, and it's certainly something I'll take back to the team because we are going to do that annually. We're always open for suggestions, so thank you. I would say that when you look at the best performing systems, their focus is not so much on extracurriculars. That they're typically focused on, the students really feel like when they're leaving high school, their job between then and leaving school is to have this academic achievement. Now, extracurriculars, running the newspaper, I don't know that we have any measures for that, but I'm happy to look into it and dig into it further.
The one thing in your book, you overwhelm us with all of these numbers, and I think you folks should trash a lot of these numbers and focus on simple things. How come teenagers can't add or subtract 2 numbers in their head? Teenagers.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 4th grader who's not up to his reading level.
Right.
How the heck did he get in 4th grade? I'm
That's
just
right.
saying, there's so much more you could do.
That's right.
Call it blocking and tackling.
That's right.
Simple stuff. I contend that the woman who taught me in the 8th grade, we're talking about 50 years ago, anymore, is more equipped to teach than the young folks today. I'm saying unless you fix the mechanism of how these teachers are being taught, you could put them any place. You could measure till the cows come home.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
I know teenagers, my grandkids, we don't need, they're told, you don't have to know how to add in your head. You've got a calculator.
Yeah.
There's something wrong. And then all of a sudden you say, well, they're not ready to go to work. They're not ready. Well, because they're not ready because the blocking and tackling was never done. And if you focus on that,
Right.
I think everything will self-correct.
Thank you. Two points on that. One, you gave me my answer. But the first is, this is meant to be a facts and figures book. It is not, these are not our KPIs, these are not measures of success. This is sort of, if you want to know where we are in education, that's what these books are for, because there are a lot of myths out there that just aren't true, and if we don't acknowledge the truth, then we can't really get to, I found myself arguing facts all the time, and I really don't want to argue facts, I just want to argue ideas. Let's get to the ideas. So that's your first point. Second point, you nailed it. We need to focus on what's going to be transformative, and Best NC is focusing on transformative change. And we have members who are working on Project Lift in Charlotte, and they're working on these programs in Durham, and they're seeing great results. But what happens is they bring a teacher or principal through their school, and they develop them, and then they get stolen away because we don't have enough of a pipeline of teacher talent. So our top priority in this legislative session has been on talent. It's been on teachers and principals, and how do we transform the way they're prepared when they get to the schools of education, having much more in-service, having much more coaching, and really looking at the curriculum. There's a real need to provide better literacy training across the board for our educators. So we are doing exactly what you just asked we do, and I thank you for giving me that opportunity to tell you that.
I am a facts and figures person, so I love this. But kind of to your point, you've got the number of remedial education for the UNC system,
Yes.
but the number of people in the community college system who have to have remedial classes. These are high school graduates from North Carolina
Right.
who have to take remedial classes, and then the percentage of them that actually graduate
That's right.
is very, very
That's
small.
right.
So you end up with the worst of all worlds. They've gone to college with student loans,
That's right.
so they have debt, they don't graduate, and they're no better off.
Yeah, we're working on adding that data point in there.
Because they graduated
Yep.
without being able
Yep.
to be able to go to even a community.
Yeah, it's something like a 65% graduation rate if you don't need remediation. It's something like 45% if you do. Don't quote me on those numbers, but it's a significant gap.
There's a huge disparity.
Absolutely, and we're actually working on adding that to the book, so thank you for bringing that up.
One of the problems with the government-provided service is the disconnect between what the beneficiary gets in benefits and the recognition by the beneficiary of what it costs to get those benefits, and who's paying the freight. On the question of educational technique or method, what has been done to look at, say, the cost of just giving a student a book and say, this is your education, learn from the book? Seems like that would be fairly cost effective versus this huge educational system we have that in some ways seems to be mired in not taking account of advances in technology,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
different methods of teaching.
Well, be sure you come back in 2 weeks and listen to Dr. Korn, because she will talk about digital learning and a transition to that, which I agree with. We do have to be careful, because if you could just give a book to a second grader, they're not going to learn. And so we are talking about the whole continuum. And it is interesting. I've looked at studies, for example, that tried to teach a foreign language over a television versus in person. There is something to be said about having that in-person coach. There's no question. And in fact, as we move to a world where we do take advantage of digital opportunities and use it in really new and exciting ways, it is not meant to replace. It is not meant to replace educators. In fact, you need higher quality educators than ever. Representative Horn has done more research on this than anybody I know, to be honest with you. And it's really important that we're not saying we're going to replace teachers with technology, but supplement and offer opportunities where you might have a classroom of 50 students in a computer lab working on practicing and so on, and then you have a really highly effective teacher in the other room working with 15 students and having more one-on-one or more directed time. So it's really rethinking the entire school and how we look at time. And then you talk about high school, and imagine a world where a student is only walking into the door a couple of hours a day, and then they're going to an internship, and then they're going to an art program. And so the world of technology opens up all sorts of opportunities. But you're talking about kindergarten through middle school, you still have this need for students to have that engagement with a teacher. So it's, again, nuanced.
Two questions that dovetail with some of the others. One, could you speak to your organization and possibly your personal views on what is contributing primarily to the decline in education enrollment as a field of study in college? And second, what is your organization's recommendations and strategy toward what I'm experiencing as an employer is a skilled labor gap? And this is a conversation that I've been having with other small business owners for the 25 years that I've been here in North Carolina, where you have a terrific workforce that's terrifically educated in mentioned earlier, HVAC, someone with some basic electrical knowledge, someone who has basic mechanical skills, someone you can hand a work order and a blueprint to and say, go accomplish this task for the day.
Yeah.
And there's that gap in the middle.
Yep.
You know, highly educated, gap in the middle, and then folks who can barely read and write.
Yep.
What are the answers?
Such a great, well, so I was looking at some numbers recently, and it's only been a couple generations since we had, you could leave high school with a high school degree, and something like 40+% of our population would get a good job. It's now like 16%. So every student needs to be leaving with something more to what you're saying.
I would argue that you can still leave high school with a good job if you're actually high school proficient. I
Right.
cannot tell you, this is anecdotal, admittedly, but I've interviewed no less than 24 people in my life who are college graduates that, in my opinion, could not read, write, do basic math at an adult level.
Yep. Yep.
And I find that
Right.
appalling.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We can talk about that. HVAC, though, being one of the examples you gave, a lot of our students don't understand what their career options are, right? And so NC Works, I credit a great deal with trying to get more information out there so a student could really look at, I'm really interested in this kind of profession, medical profession, right? And there are, if I have a certificate, if I have an associate's degree, if I have a bachelor's, if I have a master's, how many jobs are available for me if I do that? What is the average income? And they'll be surprised to find that you can be a car mechanic and make a lot more money than some,
$5,000 a year.
right, than some four-year degrees. And so just getting that information, I think, in front of students, and I really, I think that's one major point. There's a whole continuum, which is why we want to put that action group together.
To that point, what about vocational technical training in high school?
Yeah.
Again, coming from elsewhere,
Yep.
a lifetime ago,
Yep.
We had a vocational technical
Yep.
track option, and I was surprised to learn that was unavailable here in North Carolina.
It's an evolving issue. There is a fine line between tracking and offering VOTEC options, and I think what they're doing is they're finding that path. So here in Wake County, they've just started the Vernon Malone School, which offers a technical track, and they're really excited to see, well, how does that work out for the students? I think it's sort of one of those things that ended up coming at square one because it wasn't working the way it was done. It was tracking too many students out of higher opportunities, and so now they're finding their way back. But I think there's a real appetite for that. And also you see that with the early college programs as well, giving students more college opportunities or community college opportunities when they're in their high school experience. So there's a lot out there, there's a lot of opportunity, and what we're interested in is finding those great examples. I don't think there's one thing that's not being done well somewhere in North Carolina. So the question is, how do we scale, right? How do we put systems in place? How do we tear down bureaucracies so that things can happen, that it can be innovative? How do we, so that's what we're focused on.